Shelley here with Sirius Dallas Moon. This is Jupiter, the moon has just opposed Uranus, and Pluto is 1 minute away from the fourth degree. It's going to ingress to the fourth degree of Aquarius. Saturn still 29 degrees Pisces. Um, we have some days before, right? We have two, 3 days before Saturn ingresses to Aries. And I want to talk about two things that are very related. One is um, possible ways to tackle military alliances and defense budget with the growing requirement for social rights at the time of Pluto in Aries, um, without without antagonizing people that didn't go to the army, or without without trying to overpower people from demonstrating against war. And the second one is um, it's two topics, but it talks about the religious and academic real estate, the culture affiliated structures, um, and the Saturn Neptune, because I've been seeing whether it's people like Sabrina, whether it's content creators that are also academics, um, begin to address, okay, the Epstein list. I can say as an academic, there was, in retrospective, I understand that what it was, a big push for me to go to the United States from all academic. It was a requirement to almost, uh, when thinking to pursue academic career. Um, and there was a big push to actually, I don't know if put me on the island because Epstein died supposedly, okay, in prison, but the gate is still gating. Okay, the Epstein gate is still gating, um, and the fraternities and sororities rape rave rituals are the Epstein gate. Okay, um, the silencing of testimonies of people who don't, and most people that speak or speak against, they just see it as either sexual harassment, something to do with mind control that they don't want to participate in, something that tries to access their sexual energy, um, something that doesn't seem to practice academics in the academia. Um, and I was addressing the core issue around it because I was doing a thesis in the body-mind question, a philosophy of science, philosophy of medicine, with the theoretical framework of late Larry Loudon, 1990s Larry Loudon, that talks about the role of technology in turning the science from pseudoscience to actually scientific convention, because technology makes what we can't observe observable. What happens if that technology is classified and used under classified project budget? Okay, um, the laser that that we use to take down missiles can take down cities. Hopefully, they can take down toenail fungi and and cavities. So it would be good use of laser. It's not the same laser, but that's a question of frequency, and unfortunately, they are used to target individuals, to traffic them, to dehouse them, to decareer them. Um, and the colleagues are not really They have been letting that happen. So what comes up is that affects the scientific endeavor. Wait, that affects, of course, the scientific endeavor. And when the new sciences come up, or when the revived sciences come up, the attempt to get acknowledgement or academic acknowledgement exceeds and supersedes, also fund-wise, the um, requirement for the science to actually keep being scientific. Um, okay, and I give the example of, I've been talking for at least a decade about chaos theory, and how in the 70s and the 80s, chaos theory, people did not find an instructor to sign their name on any thesis or any academic research that looks into chaos. By the way, when I looked into, there was a colleague that woke up with an equation, and he called me on a research to do with earthquakes. Then I looked at it as both from the Feynman perspective, but magnets and so on and so forth. But um, uh, there seems to be an astrological. There then I was only thinking about that, but there are already astrologers that look into that, and I saw the connection. Later, I would see the manufactured, which, by the way, when we were trying to pitch the idea, I saw two things. One, nobody would look at earthquakes. It was like chaos theory. And two, when I pitch it, people ask me if I can develop an equation. Well, there's a person that woke up with an equation right next to me at the time. Um, they wanted to kill me with all the stunts I did. We actually sparked Rachel, which is national national emergency. But they were doing the research, but every 2 years they're replacing the students. Nobody actually gets accredited for breakthrough research. It was not really prompting breakthroughs. Okay, if nobody gets acknowledged for the research that they did, okay, if my friend woke up with an equation, he wouldn't just sit there in a lab and then be replaced with another after 2 years. Okay? I actually wanted to create an app that prevents earthquakes. That is and that notifies on earthquakes. And then as we pitch, I talk about the mechanism of how earthquakes happen, and I engage chaos theory. And I said, well, if we could put things into the earth, we could have a point of interference where we could regulate and prevent earthquakes. Unfortunately, um, he lost all his melanin in my face, and you couldn't call his skin type white supremacy, but but then I just left there and said, "Oh, it is a mechanikai, it's not a physikai." But then, as academics do, but then I would understand that when the weather is being manipulated, they're basically using chaos theory for the intervals, and they inject the chemicals at the intervals to create whatever events. Okay, um, that's just one thing. People ask, what's the equation? First of all, I don't remember it. Secondly, it's not my equation. So, yeah, although that person may have participated with things that I refused to, or in the beginning it didn't, but then probably changed his mind. Um, uh, but that's just one example. We have the technology to prevent an earthquake. We can predict nonlinear dynamic systems. with derivative and approximations. This is true. But that knowledge is used to collapse and control those chaotic systems that nobody is even allowed to say that we can control in praxis, because if we can predict and interfere in intervals of chaos, okay, that's how chips are brain chips are made. That's how the heart is regulated. Okay, when people have the device implanted to them, it's basically built on principles from chaos theory to re-regulate. Okay, and it was built when Pluto was conjoining Uranus. Uranus is that non-linear dynamic system, and Pluto is to be able to control. And it was in Virgo, and Virgo is the small intervals, the heartbeat, the numerics of the heart, and Mercury is ruling numerics. Okay, if I was doing a certification in astrology, I wouldn't be able to talk about this, because I would fear to lose my colleagues, my peers, even my certification and license to do astrology, because I tell you that the same scientific theory that was implemented to regulate heartbeat is implemented to manufacture so-called force majeures that affect also real estate. Patents. Okay? And I invented nothing here. I just looked at it from point of view of philosophy of science, connecting the. You see, I made no new scientific claim. I know when I innovate, and when I innovate. This I discovered nothing scientifically. Everything was already set. It's just implementation of already discovered and practiced things. And if we put a device to regulate the heartbeat, then I'm not even talking innovation. All we really need to see is the receptors to the frequency. If there is a laser that can listen to people, there's a laser that can listen to laser. Okay? Somebody said I'm bad, but I'm real. Yes, well, I don't think of this as bad. I think of this as scientific accuracy. The same reason that during the Me Too I didn't go out to litigate, other than the fact that the jurisdiction system is probably way more corrupt than even the person that tried to traffic me to something like an Epstein ring. The people that would shut up about it and do the job, they would get the positions because they needed infiltrators in academia. Now, what is the result emotionally and psychologically and well, not spiritual, but emotionally and psychologically, before spiritually other people can perhaps talk about, but the effect is that it's a tickling bomb. People are not able to go, even if they go to the church and they understand what is painted there. What do these sculptures show? It creates a cultured person, so to speak, cannot go and not see, and they cannot unsee what they see, and they cannot not see. And they cannot open a peer review paper without seeing the missing. In fact, they cannot even open their bank notes without seeing the missing. Now, this definitely can cause an explosion that the almost physical telos of energy is what people call the Cultural Revolution, which was basically just the burning of the books, the burning of the pantheons. When there was a war in Syria, the pantheons were, okay, it was around 2014. It was a nice Model UN conference. And we had to address, the pillars of culture were bombed. Now, we cannot unsee the Epstein gate in every religious monastery. The paintings on the wall. In every academic architecture. In the structure of buildings. That were made for slavery and modern slavery. It's not unprecedented that structures that were meant for slavery are abandoned or demolished. And this is something that might happen with the Saturn Neptune. The lack of calling to the classified technologies is accumulating to the abolition of the scientific endeavor itself that was missing, that was deeming that the Aries in the last degrees of Aries is the disincluded sciences. Now Saturn has 3 years before it gets to Aries conjunction, but it's the disincluded sciences. For example, Uranus Aries was astrology coming from being disincluded to included. Okay, that was around the Me Too. People began to experience things that they could only appeal to a nonlinear dynamic system, Uranus, to explain what was disincluded in their sense of self, Aries. Okay? If somebody has, to begin with, immune system challenge, and they befriend or bespouse or something of that sort, somebody that is obliged to commit treason, to keep to be the breadwinner, to actually work on their legacy. Of course, that creates onsets, and the astrological rituals, the astrological elections for the rituals, could be seen as an onset of a peak in one's chronic ailment. Now here is the thing. In some cases, something can even be justified that this is done so to treat a rare ailment or a medical condition. Okay? When Ketu was in Libra, there were many people that are having issues with kidneys. And a lot of the issues when it comes to anything Libra is sexual boundary violation. It gets relational. It's basically either trauma bond, which is more like a moon thing, but it can be a Venus thing, or something that was not relaxed arousal. And yet, organ trade is trafficking, raping people, and then when the organs are achieved through organ trade, um, the body is less able to receive the implant if they need. Okay, a traumatic body in trauma is less receptive. People say it's receptive to things that are not good for the body. It's not receptive to something that's healthy for the body. And then, of course, when something has to compromise the immune system during a global pandemic, it's now, what is the global pandemic? People are saying, oh, I have side effects from the cure. Were not listened to. Harms the fifth vital sign. Probably the doctors just assume that they don't know their bodies. And the fifth vital sign is usually the female reproductive system more. Okay, of course it affected sperm count, but nobody knows until they try to have a baby. Then doctors would be required to inject something to their blood to practice being a doctor. So what doctors are left? It's preparing the ground for what they call the cultural revolution, which was also scientific. Okay, the annihilation. And a lot of it is now that the Epstein files also like, oh, there were also academics. People are like, I was surprised to see academics there. You're not surprised when you're doing TA-ship and person tells you, I can't submit this essay. Why? You have to be diligent to submit it. And no, there was group rape. Oh, okay, I have some tea. In the parties before the semester of the fraternities and the sororities. That's the Epstein files. And as an academic, in retrospective, I understand the push for me to study, for us to study in the United States, okay, so that we are better qualified for a position as a researcher, as academic researcher, with the great competition, of course. The Okay, what is that great competition? It's not that there's not enough money. What's the potential? Think about the scientists in the 60s. What's the potential of studying and seeing patterns that we could later interfere in nonlinear dynamic systems? Heart, brain, weather. Hmm. Economy. The economy was seen as a nonlinear dynamic system. Okay, there were models that were trying to objectify economy. Voting patterns. Okay, if the brain is a chaotic system, then the voting, which is to do with identity, is that not a prospective science? Is that not a prospective field that requires allocation of resources and shit ton of positions? No, but they wanted to make sure everybody goes through a certain rite of passage. They wanted to make sure each academic researcher has a handler. That's why they silence the testimonies. It's not, oh, he said to me this, or did this, or people regulate that, don't touch that, don't say that. People can regulate. They regulate our expression in academia so much. If you use that phrase, it can create antagonism to that sector. Amazing. You want to tell me that they could regulate all of these phrases, but they couldn't regulate sexual boundary violation? Yeah. Hello. So much so that they would bother to hospitalize, sometimes even by force, people that went against men and women. Okay, the Epstein files was like, oh, these girls and these boys. In gender studies, where the trafficked madams would lecture about who can fund for a degree. In United States, who can fund for a degree? You had to be ill or trafficker. Okay, if you're not going to donate to a certain university as prospective, if you don't see as prospective donor, they don't see you as prospective student. And for heaven's sakes, they don't need the science that actually reveals what they do there. Of course, it creates a situation that prepares the ground for when the hospitals are destroyed, the scientists are discredited, the academic institution is burned, and when it happens, it is overturned with all the with all the things that were both a cover up and the things that actually led the scientists to to uh, to conclude science. Once it's destroyed, it's destroyed. Yet we cannot unsee. So this is something that I predict to happen. Moving on to the next topic. And this is military alliance at the time of Neptune in a war sign. Neptune is a quest for. Neptune makes us aware of when we have how should I say that? A condition that requires a savior. Okay, and it's the hospitality. And Aries is the sign of sovereignty. Basically, it means that there is some sort of hospitality that we need to be sovereign. And Mars is a sign of real estate. Okay, housing first to treat schizophrenia is exactly Neptune in Aries, for example. Okay, Neptune is medicine, but also psychiatry and drugs. And so we come to ask which drugs support sovereignty, which drugs take away sovereignty. For example, if somebody needs to go through surgery, they need euthanasia. Anesthesia. Euthanasia. Maybe they need it. No. They need anesthesia, okay? Um, then the reason that they need anesthesia is to preserve their sense of self. If they sleep during the procedure and wake up afterwards, their sense of self is preserved. Whereas if it wasn't so, they could develop DID as a result of the trauma of the surgery. Okay? Torture causes dissociative identity disorder. By the way, Neptune is also radiation, and there are laser treatment to teeth. Um, if your insurance doesn't cover that, then um, then people might want to check that. I don't know if they are actually pain free or not. They're definitely shorter period, very precise because it's laser. Um, and I don't know. I'm thinking to get one myself. I don't know if it's how what it's like. Um, People think when you think about root canal with laser, completely revolutionizes medicine. Is it not radiation? It is radiation, but um, nothing is perfect. um, in the sign of Neptune is also our needs to fund Mars, okay, Aries sign of Mars, a social welfare, hospitals and hospitality. Now, what happens during war simply, or during emergency, which is also Aries, simply exposes what was missing. Okay, with COVID, it was considered to be pandemic or medical warfare. Um, Exposed to me in 2019, 2020, that I was living in a student apartment and not, and I was settling for something that doesn't sustain a pandemic. Okay, if I had to be in a lockdown, I'd need a mansion, not a house. Particularly with the plot of land that I can still take a walk, exercise, maintain my health, walk the cat or the dog or whatnot, grow food. Okay, because I wouldn't ask a wild person to come to me and risk being exposed to pandemia, right? Compost trash and sustain in a lockdown without compromising my health. I mean, this lockdown is supposed to be for my health. Now, when we talk about war expenditure, that everybody needs to pay protection. Okay, if we're thinking about new countries, it's going to be sovereign countries, boom. I went through the list of military alliances. The only functioning one currently is NATO. The only one that has an Article 5, which actually forces the entire alliance to stand up if one country is invaded, is NATO. Now, I know that people talk about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand as the cause of World War I. This is also how I was told that that's bogus. They wanted to build a railway system just as they want to build now, a railway system that doesn't go through Russia from Europe to China, through the Middle East. They invited the Germans to do that. That railway system was supposed to transport children, of course, but also oil and gas. And the other empires stood in the way, and they created the Middle East. And this I was taught that we were looking at how the borders around Lebanon, Syria are painted with almost by the way, I was taught that by the person that tried to traffic me to some sort of an Epstein ring. So he had the insider knowledge. And yes, they're using dark occult, which is sad because the occult fact of there's the sister of MK Ultra, which is the Epstein case, okay, it's the medical experiments and so on. The sister of MK Ultra is MK Often. MK Often, other than laser technologies that are interfaced with summoning demonic whatnot, and those are actual studies of egregores. But okay, egregores, when a lot of people concentrate on something, they create certain entities. But this is that begin to have a behavior and manifestation. Um, Americans study that, not only Americans. But here is the thing: MK Often takes the indigenous practices of occult that were supposed to be protection from colonization and slavery and uses them to enslave people and to traffic them. Now people are going to tell me, Shirley, what naive are you? Of course, the First Nations also had trafficking and trade and slavery this and slavery that. And I'm like, okay, uh, I believe you. Not impossible. Um, But if we think that the World War I happened because of assassination of Franz Ferdinand, we would come to think that the alliances, that the so-called, that the NATO-like alliances that had an Article 5 clause, caused all the countries to join a war. Not really. They wanted the railway system, and that prompted the implementation of such an Article 5 like clause that attacked on one of the allied nations is attack on the allied nations. Okay, so there are forces calling to dissolve NATO or dissolve Article 5. Again, there may be other considerations for that, but without understanding that railway system and that the current one is going through Russia, we understand nothing. There is also the separation of the Christian Judaic. There are a lot of prime ministers that are put there with with Team Judaic. Um, and again, the Christians want to wash their hands clean of the usury that they ritually abuse the Judaic to do. And then the Judaic wants to wash their hand clean from the fact that Baal is not a god that should be worshipped, but it's also the Hebraic word for a husband. Didn't even mention circumcisions. Look, look how not anti-Semitic I am. Um, okay, because the Jews had that problem, but the Christians had the Jesuits problem, which is the same. It's the same Baal, and that was the Epstein Gates. How much time before we say the word Epstein Gate? The Gates project of MK Ultra. Now, to the money line. How do we settle between all the demonstrations that call to have housing, job opportunities, making a life while making a living, being informed and aware that wars are on rare earth minerals and natural resources, which is, I mean, nations need to fund for themselves. They need to power their cities and so on and so forth. They can collect thunders, I know, but um, but this is an understanding that when we call for so much expenses on security, where many of the patents that are used for war are also used to target civilians, people rebel. And the answer is within the question. What are we defending? If I take a look at what happened before and after each world war, okay, we don't have the statistical analysis would require 30. We're not there yet. Definitely, there are major forces working for that. Okay, that Mein Kampf is rebranded as Sparta. There is a sentence that says, in Hebrew, "Hagonev miganav patur." Okay, if you steal from a thief. But this is an inversion on even that sentence because, of course, Mein Kampf was a sort of a paraphrase on Sparta. We idealize Sparta, but I guess people idealize Mein Kampf as well. So, um, but but now we see taking from Mein Kampf and rebranding this as Sparta. Before World War One and after World War One, okay, we had a decentralization of the most impossible to touch corner of the earth, which is Russia. Geographically, it's in this Eckveld that rules over everything, and it's huge. Yeah, the Bolshevik Revolution, together with the dissolution of Standard Oil, and then we had World War One. On the railway system, before World War One, and after World War One, we still don't have that railway system not going through Russia. It's good that we have one going through Russia, but I think right now Would you take, would you would you climb on that train from Odessa? Uh, Extortion, cult logic, of course. Passage is free. Um, After World War II, way more obvious. Of course, we had the Cubism painting in the in the Middle East area of the borders. For those who did not have parents that bought those nice styles of art, yes, that is Cubism. Okay, it's those sharp shapes that try to depict a unit of analysis, an ontological unit that does not quite fit the model. In this case, human being, and in the Middle East case, countries. Venus is definitely 29 degrees Aquarius with this artistic depiction ruling over the Uranus. One was just opposing Uranus. Um, so after the Second World War, the suffragists that were in the concentration camps and were energy siphoned gave us their energy anyway. What they came to implement, those that siphoned the energy anyway had to implement, but to unlock it we need to understand what they came here to do. First of all, voting rights and financial sovereignty. Women having their own access to trade on their name and the ability to vote. Okay, all the men and women that thought that the Me Too went too far in World War I and World War II were dead. And then women, and even those that thought like that, had to suddenly run a business. Either they were too old, not so attractive, or in any case, because back then nobody talked about will and consent, or simply there were no men to even uh, uh, do a prostitution or something like that, and they actually had to have a business. And yeah, I'm talking about the woman that thought that the Me Too went too far. I guess those women had no problem being raped for money, or that other women will be raped for money. And so suddenly, when they had to run their own business, all the things that are affecting business owners coming from the government affected them. So they began to do what? They said, okay, I need to have a say. Um, and then women actually got the right to vote. Of course, they were taxed. Taxation wasn't invented by the Rockefellers. And Rockefeller probably knew that when he taxes women, they're not going to just make double income because there's going to be inflation that covers up for that. Um, and he has to launder the money somehow, so inflation does affect also extortion cults. Um, so what will this war be about? We saw the preliminary signs. I predicted that the aftermath of this war will have to do with zero rape, zero slavery society. And I was on the money because Neptune in Aries was indeed the abolitionist movement. Now, Jesuits is not the abolitionist movement. Jesuits negate abolitionism. Okay? Neptune is always about the dream and the real, the mythical and the real. What is the image of, or the Fata Morgana of, what people are longing for, I don't know, human rights, sovereignty, and they had the Jesuits. That was not the thing. That was the Fata Morgana, but the Fata Morgana does manifest. People actually, when people talked about the First Amendment in United States Constitution, or the right to vote, they didn't mean black people. But then they had to stand in their own legislation or abolish their own legislation in which they could be re-enslaved by black people as they were before the slave trade changed colors. So if we understand what we defend, when all of this money, what is it meant to do? Then we understand that many of the defense needs are one-in-one with preventing invasion. Okay? What is the easiest example is schizophrenia, because the cure for schizophrenia is housing first, to quit the targeting of the individuals. Let's say somebody say, "Oh, they're using laser weapon around." It's like there's not even such technology. Okay, useless. Because if I need to defend from invasion, I need to declassify, and I need to think what are the classified technologies that are of the neighboring countries. One of them is wave-based Neptune, frequency-based technology that is used to harm sovereignty or dissolve the sense of self. And I understand that my military alliance will need to abolish maluse of wave-based technology. How do I do that? I use wave-based technology to negate and to support sense of self, to treat any fungal or infection, for example. The €1 houses in Italy that have black mold in them, to make it a project to dissolve the black mold. Now we got livable housing. They can definitely be used for people that have a housing first case. Now, once we have enough of those, if somebody comes from an enemy country, instead of, by the way, Prisoner X was an 8200 elite unit young soldier officer that was very likely assassinated in the cell in Israel. Okay, I didn't speak about that because I reside in Israel and I didn't feel I have the okay, to look into Prisoner X. I would need something to support me even looking into the phenomena. I talked about political prisoners, and yeah, 8200 is no longer an elite unit after that case. I had one case where I knew I had I knew a person who was teaching Irani language, Farsi, in 8200, even though I wasn't in the military myself. Again, my father served in NATO. Biological father served in IDF, but my father served in NATO. And Um, Basically, when I was in the open apartments, which was supposed to be volunteering, um, I was giving private classes to a very, very bright um, young lady, and then she asked me if I can connect her with anybody at 8200. Then I made a connection. I would not be feeling comfortable to make such a connection ever again. Um, that was an elite intelligence unit. Okay. By the way, if you wonder why I made that connection, because I wanted to open the opportunities. Usually people don't have that in the Manila, which is when people have mandatory army recruitment. NATO is also about to have that. They have the units that are open to them. The geographical region of Negev was not opening 8200 in the Manila. And I wanted the person that if they have mandatory army service, um, that they will at least have the ability to navigate into a unit where they're less likely to be raped. Um, and also the point of 8200 was to supposedly prevent terror attacks or invasion, which it didn't do. Not in the case of Iran, and not in the case of the extortion cults coming from Palestine. Nor in the case of the correct strategic response to trafficking and ritual abuse extortion cults coming from a neighboring country. Okay, so when we understand what do we defend, what is the telos anyway in the aftermath of the coming war, and this is zero rape, zero slavery society on a worldly scale. We already have worldly organizations, worldly governance, and I'm not even talking deep state, okay? World Economic Forum is a worldly governance, it's an allocation of resources. Politics is allocation of resources, okay? So, world discussion about allocation of resources is a world government. Now, if a person comes from enemy country, for example, what would Israel had better done with prisoner X? Housing first, maybe safety housing, independent of ability to work, to listen to his testimony and to believe it and to protect it. I don't know if I want to even begin to reconsider how entire face of earth would look like if we did that. How old was he then? I don't think he was even 90. And the fact that we cannot have mandatory recruitment to a place where people are murdered or suicide in. Okay, it's basically considered a crime against humanity. All of these problems are relevant because many of the things that anyway would happen after the war, that they're supposed to be the things that we defend. When we defend democracy or say that we defend democracy,